Okay, so we are here for draft deep dive number two. This episode on Moltres. After a great regular season and a great week seven, especially versus Jace, and also a great week six. Just really a clutch end of the season run by Moltres for my team, which inspired me to make this episode on it. So, what's our question in this draft deep dive? Is Moltres-Galar really worse in non-Dynamax? Because I feel like I think no one was saying that it would be bad in non-Dynamax or that it was, unviable or anything like this. But I mean, obviously reflected in the point total that people thought it was slightly worse in non-Dynamax, I guess. 17 points in season four out of the highest was 19 points in season four, and then in season six, 15 points out of a possible 18 on the point board. So, slight, or at least according to the tier list, slight regression in that sense. And it does, of course, make sense. There's merit behind Moltres being worse in non-Dynamax. So what does Moltres lose? Well, Moltres actually loses quite a bit in non-max. So first of all, um, Moltres has really good max moves. Um, unlike something like Conkeldurr, which really hates that its only stab is fighting, which weakens its moves, or other Pokemon, basically any other fighting or poison Pokemon. Um, Moltres actually really likes both of its max moves. Airstream speeding you up is the best max move, probably. Um, in fact, it's certainly the best max move. So it certainly enjoys that, especially at like the sort of middling speed tier it's at. Um, and then Dark is also good. Moltres really strong Dark attacks, and those are obviously going to lower the special defense of opponents, which just helps Moltres even more because Moltres with the 100 special attack needs help. So obviously it has boosting items like Life Orb or Weakness Policy, but um, further knocking out something that it knows it can knock out with Darkness, like I don't know, some frail psychic type, um, and then weakening the partner for a follow up on the next turn. Very strong. So both of the max moves are very, very strong for Moltres, and it can reliably grab Okos while also getting beneficial boosts. In addition, obviously Goltres gets more bulk, which is beneficial because Moltres is one of those, in that class of Gigalith, Moltres, Metagross types where they're super bulky weakness policy Dynamax threats. So, you know, either they already have their weakness policy off and it's really hard to remove them still because they're so bulky while they're grabbing Okos, or you're terrified to hit them with a super effective move because they'll boost up and they will run through your team. So the bulk obviously helps Moltres a lot. 90, 90, 125 is really, really good HP defense, special defense. Um, I guess physically it's like solid bulk, not much more, not much less, and then especially it's very bulky. And then by the time that you Dynamax, physically quite bulky at that point, and then especially just nothing is getting through you, essentially. And then the benefit of even more bulk from max, because obviously you double your HP, is that when you're activating your Berserk on Moltres, you're still difficult to remove at half health. So, if you weren't Dynamaxed, a lot of things can reliably get that KO from half health uh, on Moltres, but when it's maxed, you know, the max on the other team will still be able to do a lot of damage to it and remove it, but if that's gone, non-max Pokemon are gonna maybe struggle to remove Moltres even if it has its even if it even after it's triggered its Berserk, which is just going to make things much harder defensively, obviously. And then so this is great Dynamax strategies. It was supposed to be synergies. So yeah, Moltres. I don't know, just based off typing stats and just Berserk and everything. It has some very quality synergies in Dynamax. So obviously Comfey is the big one. You have Priority Draining Kiss, which is very little damage, and Weakness Policy, as well as Floral Healing to get multiple Berserks off. Um, you know, great great synergy there. And then even things like um, I mean, I think Ninetales is probably the second best. Good Ninetales, of course, with you know Ice Shard, Aurora Veil, basically anything that can trigger Moltres' weakness policy and also give it supplement bulk or heal it or otherwise help it out. So all of those things synergize really well with Moltres and give you like a really good two-mon mode, two-mon lead, whatever whatever you want to call it. Um, so that obviously benefits Moltres. And then I think my first big negative, so I do the two negatives for a big negative. So I think this is I'll have to describe this. So I said that Moltres is amongst the best when to maxers. So what do I mean by that? So Moltres, this is seen a lot on ladder too. Like when there's colossal Urshifu Dragapult Moltres, that was I believe that was a thing at some point. Um, and basically, oh, I guess on that team you wouldn't have weakness policy, so never mind. But I remember, especially on ladder, Moltres had this because I never used it in draft. When it in any Dynamax draft format. But I remember very clearly on ladder that Moltres is very good at manipulating your opponent as to when you're going to max, especially on those crucial turn ones. You can either often, maybe max and start airstreaming. If you have like a Comfey, you can weakness policy airstream, or if your opponent's going to try to protect to stall out your max, you can just hit a nasty plot, and then you're going to be a terrible problem for the rest of the game because you can max the next turn. And then you have a third option. If your opponent is looking to attack you, you can simply just protect, take lesser damage, activate a weakness policy, maybe get speed control, and then again you're putting yourself in a position to win, especially if your opponent's maxed mon is then in a vulnerable position. So you have this, I think it's mainly the trio protect, nasty plot, max of options that makes it very difficult to play around Moltres because it's always controlling when it wants to max, and it can both make it difficult for your opponent's max Pokemon and um, it can make it difficult for your opponent's um, offensive prospects with their max Pokemon and make it very difficult defensively as well because it's unpredictable when it's going to max. Um, and it gives you that sort of multifaceted Dynamax sweeper um, that can stay unmaxed as long as it wants to, basically, or as long as it's beneficial. That I think honestly very few Pokemon are able to do because they just don't have that type of versatility that Moltres does, which was so strong. And then obviously, the main reason Moltres was so good, um, which I prefaced with the synergies. It's just a fantastic weakness policy abuser. Moltres is just one of those Pokemon. It's not going to take very much damage when you're setting up its weakness policy. It really needs the boost too, is a big thing to be successful. And you know, if something else is hitting it, maybe it's also hitting it to Berserk, and you better be sure you're killing it. Otherwise, you have a +3 attack coming in. And then maybe you're also airstreaming with that, so you're getting faster, you're taking advantage of the speed, you get to attack twice, and then it's a huge problem. So Moltres, amongst the best weakness policy users, is part of the reason why it was so good in Max. Or, in fact, it was a lot of the reason why it was so good in Max. Um, so obviously um, losing losing, because you can still use weakness policy in non-max, of course, but losing the effectiveness of max plus weakness policy for Moltres is really unfortunate for its prospects in a non-max format, of course. Um, and then aside from, like I said, bulk and um, being like middling strength, Moltres also has like it just has good type weaknesses for weakness policy setting. So you have your ice shards, you have Comfey, specifically Draining Kiss, you have even like weak volt switches were pretty good sometimes, like Raichu, which isn't even that weak. It's just that Moltres is such a special tank that even when if it's maxed especially, you could throw a volt switch at it. Um, so really fantastic weakness policy user. Especially in draft, the max formats were totally dominated by the weakness policy users. So being good at that obviously is was great for Moltres. And then slight negative I said was that there's no beneficial non-max metagame to develop. Oh, okay, this is really repetitive. No beneficial non-max metagame to develop Moltres-Galar. So what I mean by this is there hasn't been a ladder that's non-max without restricted Pokemon. So in restricted formats, Moltres sucks because Zacian exists and Yveltal exists. So basically, there's a Pokemon that does its job just significantly better, and two, a Pokemon that will literally just OHKO it like anytime it's on the field. So that's a huge problem, and it just sees no play, even now in a max format. And also just the fact that Moltres likes to be the main sweeper, and it's less needed when you have restricted Pokemon, of course. So yeah, Moltres Galar hasn't had a chance to develop in a non-max metagame, which I think slightly hurts not how it is in reality, maybe, but how we view it because we just haven't seen it develop. Um, we haven't seen it develop in a metagame, which could maybe inform us more on how we could use it in draft, because that's a lot of times what happens, um, which obviously doesn't hurt how it actually performs, but hurts maybe how we look at it a little. So I just wanted to include that. Okay, so what does Moltres gain? And is it enough to make up for it? So Moltres, as much as we want to talk about how it was elite max threat and how it lost so much, it also does gain a lot. It really does. So first of all, random coverage is less, or any coverage is less strong in non-max. Um, you know, Jordan talked about this in his Rainbow Mons video. He said that they're still important, which I agree with. Um, but coverage is really not quite as important because you're just simply not hitting as hard. You're not grabbing those Okos with your coverage anymore in non-max, which is beneficial to Moltres because Moltres has, limited coverage. It's Hyper Voice, Shadow Ball, and Ancient Power, I believe, are all of the coverage moves. I mean Hex, but that's just Shadow Ball um, on the special side, and then it has physical coverage, but that's obviously not mainly what you're going to be using. Um, so of course, coverage being less useful is beneficial to a Pokemon which simply doesn't have as much coverage because it's not losing out on as much by not having Flash Cannon or Earth Power or all of these different moves that it would maybe have wanted in a max format. And then in addition, um, you know, the fact that, aside from not having coverage, Moltres doesn't even really need coverage. It runs Flying in Dark, and that's going to hit the vast majority of things for super effective damage. I don't have the thing that Jordan usually pulls up where it shows how many things you can hit super effectively and neutrally, but um, it's not it doesn't really Moltres doesn't really hate a format where it's encouraged to just use two stabs because that's what it's good at. Is basically the point of that first plus. And then the second one is that really the Moltres really doesn't die. So yes, it loses out on the bulk that Max gives it, but you're slowing down the game, and you know Max only lasts 3 turns, of course. The, without Max, the opposing team really just doesn't have the opportunity to take its one big blow. Um, or its one big attack at Moltres unless it has a Pokemon that specifically matches up well against it. So like an example of that would be like I had to watch out a lot for Jace's Terrakion this week, and it's basically why I needed to run Protect as opposed to wanted to run Protect, is that that was a Pokemon that seriously threatened Moltres on within one turn. But there aren't really that many of those anymore because you really just need like super effective physical coverage if you want to really threaten it in one turn at this point because that's how bulky it is. Um, and then it can, since the pace is slowed, it it has ways to um, it has ways to navigate the more dangerous moves without being punished quite as much. Also, slight positive to Moltres is that it has more variety in item and set in non-max. So Moltres now, I have been running a lot of the same moves, but you could argue more for stuff like taunt, and I think it gets taunt, taunt, and I don't know, random other useful moves, just because the pace is a little bit slowed and it doesn't need to run. Maybe you don't need to run both stabs even when you definitely would need to in a max format. Although I would still say that, your moves are still relatively the same or are still relatively limited to what they were in max. So air slash, snarl, fiery wrath, protect, nasty plot, maybe hurricane. That doesn't really change a ton. Um, but what does change a lot is the items you can run, which allows you to run a variety of sets as well. Even if your moves aren't changing so much. So like just this season, I've run Assault Vest, Pinchberry, Leftovers this week, Weakness Policy twice. So you can run a lot of and Mental Herb. No, not Mental Herb, White Herb. Um, so you can run a lot of stuff on Moltres now, because it's freed from, I wouldn't call it a burden that it was so good at weakness policy that you wouldn't run other stuff, but it certainly reduces the flexibility, or not flexibility, but the variety that a Moltres can play with, um, because its one set was so strong. Now you can run so many different things, and you know, I would say that the top four-ish items: assault vest, leftovers, pinchberry, weakness policy. I would say that's the top four probably. Those are all like about equally effective, which is really, is obviously really strong to just have that variety. And then just because since it's not max, you don't need to be trying to win Airstream Wars, or um, it's not super important. It's not quite as important to be moving before your opponent. So Moltres can be a little freer to go bulkier, which is what I did this week, and abandon the speed if it needs to, because it just has that much bulk that if you want to lean into it, you can, weather the attacks and be fine. Which is nice because in max, often you have to go fast and strong because that's just the nature of the format. Um, Another slight positive is that healing, like allies healing for Moltres, is more effective. Just because heal pulse, flora healing, all those moves have, and if well, so they heal the same amount of HP to a max target, but a smaller proportion of it, which for most Pokemon isn't a huge deal, but for Moltres can be a big deal because its Berserk might not activate if you're not getting it back over 50% health. And the same thing happens with like a Pinchberry, even though it wouldn't really run that in max. Just the fact that the proportion of the health that all of those things heal on non-max Pokemon is greater, obviously allows you to trigger Berserk more, um, which is obviously beneficial for Moltres. Um, and then I'll come back to this, but another positive for Moltres, this I was considering doing a double plus, is that it's harder to outpace Moltres, which was a very good way to beat it in the past. Um, but I'll move forward and come back. So, um, the biggest thing that I thought goes in Moltres' favor in non-max is that the max moves that Moltres are replacing, they're very good max moves. I already talked about that. However, Moltres is hurt less by not having Darkness and Airstream than other Dark and Flying Pokemon. So, for instance, um, okay, so I have Fiery Wrath right here. So basically, no other Pokemon is going to replace Max Darkness with a move as good as Fiery Wrath, because Fiery Wrath is just completely broken. Well, not completely broken. Fiery Wrath is like just it like really really good exclusive move. So the fact that no other Pokemon gets it and no other Pokemon is going to replace their Max Darkness with Fiery Wrath is beneficial to Moltres as opposed to those Pokemon, because it has a better dark move as opposed to having the same dark move as those Pokemon. And then flying Pokemon, there's two reasons why Moltres doesn't mind losing Airstream as much as other flying types. So first of all, look at things like Kanto Zapdos, which are, or no, Kanto Zapdos, I think it's Air Slash. Um, I don't know, but the flying moves are sometimes not super well um, are not super well spread. So I'm sure there are some. I can't remember. I think Zapdos has Air Slash, so it's a bad example. But there are certainly flying Pokemon that base their air streams off of Hurricane and Hurricane only, so they don't have the option to run Air Slash for more accuracy. Um, and then in addition to that, um, Moltres was worse than many other flying type Pokemon at using Airstream, even though Airstream is good for Moltres because it's just not as fast. So like Zapdos, this time is a good example. Zapdos is at 100 base speed, so it could it could continue to flex that speed advantage over Moltres by just Airstreaming first and continuing to Airstream first. Um, but now that obviously doesn't happen, so you don't have the effect of another flying Pokemon matching up with Moltres and having that difference in speed end up affecting the entire team because of the Airstream boosts, if that makes sense. So basically, its chair stream, its air. Oh my god, I called it chair stream. Its airstreams are worse than other flying types airstreams, so it doesn't mind losing out on airstream as much as other flying types do. And I think the effect that um, Moltres' good non-max moves have is actually quite huge because, well, Fire Wrath itself is great, um, and also it can flinch non-Dynamax Pokemon, so it's even better in non-Dynamax. It's just a fantastic move, and then it Moltres also has the slight benefit of not losing out on quite as much with the Airstream as other flying types. Is basically what I'm trying to get at. And then finally, games are more setup centric, and that's a slight positive. So games being more setup centric, um, that's a little bad for Moltres because Moltres, with its lower base power, I mean, with its lower base special attack, and lack of weakness policy, really dislikes the fact that the pace is slowed because its its weakness, frankly, as an attacker, is highlighted more in a format where it can't just have its weakness policies procced easily and go to town. However, a more setup centric game is good for Moltres because Moltres is a fantastic setup mon. Um, so Moltres nasty plots are one of the best setups in probably one of the best setups in the format. It's just once you get that fire wraths, it becomes so brutal to deal with a Moltres. And then if you focus it too hard, um, it could just throw a protect so easily. And since it's not sweeping in max anymore, you're losing out on less by just protecting. You're not losing a max turn by protecting, which is nice for it. So it can sort of control its pace like that really well and set up really well, um, and just be difficult to remove. And it likes that pace, even if it sort of misses what it was able to do in the faster paced Dynamax format, if that makes sense. So the pace of this format both gives and it takes um, from Moltres. Um, so back to the harder to beat Moltres by outpacing it. So this kind of relates to what I was saying about Moltres not caring quite as much about losing its airstream as other flying types. So basically, Moltres, it's at that weird speed tier. It's obviously not a max. It's obviously not a trick room threat. Excuse me. Even with like Iron Ball, it wouldn't be that slow. And obviously you wouldn't do that. It would just be bad. Um, but it's also not quite fast enough to be a fast sweeper either. Um, so that's it's in a tough spot at 90 base speed where it's getting outsped by, I would say, most premier max threats because especially ones that are airstreaming, it's just getting out airstreamed, and it's tough for Moltres. And a lot of times what will happen is you'll have a fast, powerful attacker max, and then hit Moltres with a strong rockfall or thunder or whatever the fairy one's called, um, Starfall, um, or any of these other really strong, super effective moves, and they'll do it really fast. And like I said, this is a really good way to chunk Moltres that's not really available in um, non-Dynamax quite as often, just because you need those as stab now. Basically, you really need them as stab now, whereas before you could get away with them as coverage. So it just limits what's truly threatening Moltres by outpacing it on turn one, and then in addition to that, you don't have the faster airstreamers that can threaten to speed up the entire team and beat Moltres by outpacing it like that. So Moltres as a slower, bulkier mon just likes that it's more difficult to outpace it in these slower paced games. So I think it Moltres Moltres the Pokemon likes the slow paced game, but Moltres the Pokemon also likes weakness policy, which was a big part of Dynamax. Is sort of the big issue that's going on with Moltres between the two, or that's the give and take between the two formats. Is that Moltres likes Dynamax because it likes weakness policy, and it likes the fast, it likes how fast it can scale in Dynamax, but it also doesn't like how fast other things can attack it in Dynamax. Um, which I guess is sort of true for everything, but it's especially true for Moltres, and that's basically um, the big difference of where we're at with Moltres in this non-Dynamax format. So is Moltres better in non-max, or is it worse? I really don't know. Um, lean that it's slightly worse, but it really just adopts a slightly different playstyle, and I think it's slightly more flexible. It's certainly more slow paced in non-max, and I think it suits the Pokemon. Um, it's not quite as good of a weakness policy threat, so it doesn't have the same turn one threat that it used to, but you know maybe just we just have to think about the Pokemon differently. I don't think it makes it less valuable inherently. Um, I'm excited to see, as it says on the screen, I'm excited to see where Moltres will go in the non-max future in both draft and ladder. Whenever there's a non-restricted format, of course, because it doesn't want to get um, absolutely destroyed by Zacian or shown up by Yveltal. Um, I think it's a really great Pokemon. I was prepared drafting it this season to be a little underwhelmed, thinking that it was not going to be quite as good as it was in Max, just because it really loved those weakness policy strategies. That's sort of what its identity was in Max. Um, but I've learned that it's really a very threatening um, it's a really threatening setup mon. Berserk is still really threatening. You can still weaken his policy sometimes. Both of its stabs are great, which is really good. You never feel compelled to run coverage. Not that you really have it, but like you're really fine hitting stuff with your stabs, which I think is really, it's really good in this format because like I have Entei too, of course. Entei also has a fantastic near um, unique um, stab move in Sacred Fire. And what I see with Sacred Fire on the calc all the time is that um, like Sacred Fire sometimes is like doing as much or more than super effective coverage when it's neutral. Um, just because you just can't pack the same punch with coverage, especially when like Ente's and what Entei was using for Max Quake this whole time was Stomping Tantrum, which obviously is not very strong. Um, so you have a lot of these compromises on coverage moves that got hidden, or at least a little hidden, or not hidden is not the right word, or at least a little concealed by max moves. But now they're a little worse. All these Pokemon that have the punches and moves like Stomping Tantrum that are not great, but they just sort of have them randomly. They can't quite use them to the same effect. But Moltres, doesn't really need those moves. It runs fine and it runs dark and it's gonna hit everything on your team neutrally. And if it's nasty plotted up, nothing is really too safe, but also nothing can really take it down. Um, I really like where it's at. That's basically the point of this video. Okay, so MVP moment. That's it. That's the video.